Hi, I'm Win, cycling instructor, and today I picked up this bike for free. It's a 1991 Marin Palisades Trail. This is a near top of the line bike of its era. It's made with double butted chromoly Tange steel frame and fork. It has a tapered fork, that's nice. It's been sunburned, it's been outside for a long time, and this is just as I picked it up. I haven't done anything to it. Let's take a closer look. So this color scheme is supposed to be black with fluorescent yellow highlights, and the handlebar is painted fluorescent yellow also, but it's faded to be a light yellow, and so this would take some work. Good thing is fluorescent yellow is fairly easy to get as a spray paint in the hardware store, and perhaps with some polishing gently, a light layer of clear coat can go onto it. There's some stickers that were added here. This has 26-inch tires. They're rotten, so they can't be saved, front and rear. Chain is very rusty. This uses the Shimano BioPace chain rings. Those are good. The front shifters and the rear shifters, the mechanism doesn't work, and so that'll need to be opened up and oiled and see if we can loosen it up. It has a roller here to increase leverage on the gear, and so that's kind of nice. The cantilever brakes all work. I'm assuming that has the improved spring on the pivots, so the casing is not likely to break. It uses the LX derailleurs, and it has the metal platform pedals. The chain rings are steel, and the cranks are aluminum. It has a road gear three-spar rear rack, and that's good. I'm not able to open up this quick release. Let's see if I use a metal pipe as a crowbar, if I can open this, and alright, that kind of works. Sometimes you need additional leverage. Alright, and so this is good. The seat post isn't frozen. That would be a disaster if it was stuck. Let me turn the bike around. Okay, so it also has a kickstand here, a Greenfield, which is the Plesher licensed version, and there's a sticker here that says Tange steel. So this is what I've read on the specs from retrobike.co.uk. They have the specifications and the catalogs of a great number of major mainline bike companies. Alright, and it has quick releases front and rear, has a little bell. Alright, and so this bike could be used as a touring bike. It has the tapered fork, which gives it some comfort. It's made with good frame geometry. It already has a rear rack. That's a good rack. That's what I also use on one of my touring bikes. So I think, first things first, it needs to get dusted off, cleaned off, washed, and then we'll take off the tires and service the hubs, clean up the gears, true the rims, and then from there we can take a look at what I've done as in other videos is, service the headset and work out the brakes and the shifting, and then work our way down to the cranks and the chain, the derailleur. This bottom bracket is a cup and cone bottom bracket. It's not a cartridge, and so that can be taken apart, and we can take a look at the bearings and replace those as needed, and probably will be needed. Okay, to take off this Billy Bong sticker, I'll use a blow dryer on hot, heat it up to loosen up the adhesive, and then we can easily peel it off. This saddle is kind of gone. I might be able to seal it up, but I also have a spare saddle that I can use, and give this one away to somebody who has a saddle that's even in worse condition. Okay, so let me go to work on this, and I'll get back to you with some of the results in the next video. This is what it looks like now after I went over it with a little dust broom. And the 7-speed cluster is a cassette, so that's what I expected it to be. And it also has an alloy water bottle cage here, so that's kind of nice. The brakes seem to work pretty well. What I want to point out is some of these vintage mountain bikes, they use 6mm brake housing as well as a much thicker brake cable. So if at all possible, and on my previous bikes they also had this too, I don't want to replace these brake cables because they're very hard to come by. It's not easy finding 6mm cable housing anyway, and so these generally don't rust. They're either a stainless or they've been galvanized, and I think most of these are have some grade of stainless steel in them, and so they've always been in good shape. So as long as I can take care of it and I don't need to replace the cables, then that saves me a lot of time. So this front wheel is a Joytech hub with an Orion rim, and this rear wheel looks like a Shimano with another Orion rim, but they're different. So one of these wheels is a replacement wheel.
Last night, a little bit. Which is somewhat unusual, but still working really.
So I took apart the Marin bike and repainted the handlebars to see how that turned out, and I'll show that to you in a minute. But for now, I'll just wash this bike. So the wheels have been washed. The rim tape is in pretty good shape still. So this is the front wheel. I'll take a 13mm front hub wrench on one side, an adjustable wrench, and we'll loosen up the lock nut. All right. If you do it right, you can do it pretty quickly. So I'll loosen up the lock nut pretty fast, pretty far out, bring the wheel vertical, and loosen up the cone. Might need to bring this all the way out. Bearings are pretty dry. Put a shot of oil in there. These are Joytech hubs, and Joytech hubs are pretty good. Give that a spin. Turn it over, and I'll loosen the other side while I'm pushing up. And I'll put another slug of oil in there. This is SAE weight, 30 weight oil. It's kind of hard to find, so you might need to use chainsaw oil, which is SAE 30 weight oil without the additives to make it into a motor oil. So it's not nearly as good. If you don't care about the smell, you can use a Hypoid gear oil. That's SAE weight 90 weight oil. That's better, but it has a high sulfur content, so it'll tend to smell. So tighten this up so that it has some compression on the bearings. Could actually be on the loose side because this is a quick release, and the quick release will tend to squeeze in the bearings and pre-compress them. So yeah, make them this more on the looser side. And sometimes working on the other side of the axle will make it easier to lock the cone to the lock nut. All right, that feels good. All right, this one's done, and so it's ready for me to put it on the chewing stand. Okay, here's the drive side, and I'll need to remove the cassette to take off the chain guard, but for now I'll lube this side here. And this, I think, uses a 15 millimeter because it's a rear and it's a larger diameter axle. And I'll use so the orientation is when you're removing the lock nut will be to the left of your spanner. And that way, with one hand, you can loosen the whole thing. So this has a lock nut and some spacers. So what you want to do is remember the number of spacers that you have. Order, and this has a thrust washer in it too. And from here we can loosen up the cone just enough so we can take a peek and look at the condition of the bearings, which look good. The condition of the cone, it's not pitted. So then we'll give it a large slug of oil, twice the amount, because we want it to dribble through onto the cassette side. Since we can't get to it because right now the cassette is on the bike. All right, and then we'll put it all back together again. So here's a thrust washer, 2 spacers, and the nut. And this nut has an inside and an outside to it, so just be aware of that. Pay attention. Okay. And then when installing it, then the lock nut wrench will be on the right side of your hub wrench. And hold of this one. Yeah, that feels good. And just make sure these are all tight, so that you don't go out of adjustment. The rim tape on this is good, so then what I'll need to do is, if I feel like it, remove this, remove the chain guard, then we'll put this on the truing stand. In the meantime, I'll let these wheels lean on the side, and so let any excess oil dribble out. We're going to true up the Marin. This is the front wheel. So let's see how this is. And okay, so the left hand I have the wrench, the right hand I have my pliers, and this time. We'll start here at the valve hole, and looks like we'll make some minor adjustments here. I can hear when it scrapes the side of the feeler gauge. This rim is in pretty good shape. All you need to do is pay attention to what side the wobble is on and which side the spoke is connected to the hub, and pull it in the direction of or loosen the spoke on the opposite side. All right. And then you work your way into bend. Either tightening the spoke clockwise or loosening the spoke counterclockwise. Okay. And then work your way into the wobble. Don't over tighten the spoke where, like this one, the nipple strips. Definitely something here. Sometimes the wobble swings from the far left to the far right. So you can only true it. You have to split the difference and try working it, and once you're done, stress relieve the spokes, you might have to do this a couple of rotations. All right, let's move to the front, to the rear wheel. Okay, the spacing is different on the rear, so bring that out. I always try to have the drive side on my right side also. Okay, so this is true, but the dish is a little bit too far onto the drive side, so I'm going to try to pull it to the non-drive side to get it centered up. I'll start with the valve stem hole, and we'll go from there. All right, so I'll give all of the non-drive spokes a quarter turn. And these spokes are a little bit on the loose side, so this wheel's been ridden quite a bit. Spokes loosen up over time. And you clamp them with a pair of pliers so that the spoke doesn't twist when you're turning the nipple. Okay, we'll pull it now a little to the drive side. These spokes are loose too. Okay, and so I think this rear wheel is a replacement wheel. It has galvanized steel spokes, and I think the original had stainless steel spokes like on the front. So I think this is a replacement. It's also a no-name hub also. Okay. And it has the rear cassette. The cassette's not exactly matches the quality of the bike. So I think this is a replacement wheel. Alright, so then I disassembled the Marin Palisades and I repainted it, and what I used was some wetter dry sandpaper, about 600 grit. And the first thing I did is I taped it off the margins, and then I used some white paint as an undercoat. And then once I had that dried for about a day, then I used some fluorescent green paint, but I probably should have used fluorescent yellow instead to get the correct color, but it still turned out okay. Between the two, you need to let this dry overnight, and then you can apply this. If you don't, you'll end up with a crinkled finish. Once that's done, and if you do have a crinkle, then you're going to need to use the wetter dry sandpaper with some water to sand it off and then repaint it. Is you can seal it up with some clear, and that will give it a glossy finish. Okay, there was a lot of scratches on the bike down here and chipped paint, so I casually sprayed some black paint over it. I just masked over some of the marks. This is a flat paint, and so I needed to go over it again with some clear so that it would become glossy. And as long as you don't put down a lot, then you won't see an overspray of that. Okay, to make sure I have a good spray control, I use a handle that after I shake shake the can, I aim the nozzle forward, and now I've got a handle, so it's more like a paint gun, and it keeps your fingers from getting painted. Okay, so this is the quick release for the bike. It was missing the nut, and so when I removed it, it fell apart. So I found another 5mm nut for this and put it down, and then I applied some Loctite to it so it won't unscrew. This is a seat post. It comes out easily, and so what I'll do is I'll put some grease on the seat post, put on the nut, put on the seat post clamp, and then we'll hang that on the rack. So this is some grease. We'll apply that to the inside of the seat tube. Then I'll take the clamp, right? We'll leave a lot of it sticking out. And then I'll loosen up this. All right, now we're in business. So let's remove the tape. And so I
masking the whole area. So it's just a matter of removing the masking and the tape. The better job you do in masking and preparing the surface, the better your paint result is going to be. And certainly you don't want overspray on your work since all this time to try to make do a nice job anyway. So it was 105 degrees earlier today. The heat's broken, so now we're on the downward slope. It's a lot cooler now. All right. There's a manufacturer's decal. And so I'll take off that tape too. It's just a lot of small pieces of masking tape. So let me stop the camera and we'll take a close-up.
Alright, so here's the head tube. And I just masked over where the paint stops. And so I'll clean up this with some solvent, but the lines look fine. Alright, and you can see over here I just painted over the chain guard, but this was all chipped up with white paint showing through, so it looks pretty good after I clean it up. Alright, this is also the handlebar. It was painted green, and you can kind of get an idea of what the original color is. Down at the edges is that fluorescent yellow, though on their catalog it said fluorescent green, so I bought fluorescent green, but it's really fluorescent yellow. Okay, so the next step is to install the headset, and I'll show you how I do that without using an expensive tool. So this is the bottom bracket, and so I'll need to remove the cranks, and so I can take apart the adjustable cup and lube the bearings. To work on the bottom bracket, we need to first remove the cranks, and oftentimes there's a cover, so you remove the cover and then we'll need to remove the crank bolt. To remove the crank bolt, we have a thin wall socket. Sometimes a regular socket might work also. And so this comes out counterclockwise. Sometimes they're pretty tough. And if they are, then get some rope and tie the crank to the frame so that the crank doesn't rotate. Okay, let's put the parts in a container so we don't lose it. This is an integrated socket that's removable, as well as a crank remover. So I'll back out the protruding stub, and then I'll carefully screw this in. You want to make sure that the remover is screwed all the way in and makes contact to the base of the crank. The threads are fine, and so the amount of pressure that you exert on it, if the extractor isn't completely embedded in the crank, could strip out. Right. So now we can screw this in. If in doubt, unscrew this some more and then see if it continues to tighten. Alright, so let's give this a try. And we'll start screwing in the extractor. And once it comes free, it'll become easier. Here we go. And then we can remove this. And I'll flip the bike over and we'll repeat on the other side. Okay. Okay. Pry out. Ooh, almost lost the socket there. This is a 14mm or 15mm socket, and most of them I've found are 14mm. Okay, that one comes up, loosens up pretty quickly, without much force. There's a lot of noise outside there. Our neighbors have their gardeners doing their work. I can feel that there's some binding when I rotate the crank, so I'm sure the crank will need some work. All right. Okay. Bicycle repairs are typically time-consuming, if anything. They might not be hard, but they'll consume a lot of time. So while you have the crank off, this is a good time to clean it and to remove all the rust and to inspect the teeth and everything. These are steel rings, so these will last a very long time. Sounds like there's some vibration here, so maybe some of these bolts are loose also. So I'll give that a chance to tighten it up. And there's some flaring on some of these teeth, so I'll use a flat file to file these away also. Okay, so on the drive side, there are some wrench flats here. This is the fixed side of the bottom bracket. The other side is the adjustable side. This is the side we'll work on. Okay. Before I work on this, let me get a wire brush and we'll clean this up. Alright, so here's a wire brush. And use this to get rid of the FOD and the corrosion. Now, there was a lock ring here, and I have a lock ring removal tool, and this is a better bottom bracket as bottom bracket goes, and so the adjustable cup has a series of holes in it instead of wrench flats. So to use that, we have to remove this. We have a part tool. This one happens to be an SPA 6, and it's called a pin wrench. They call it an adjustable spanner. And as long as you have the two holes, two pins, they'll fit in here and you can spin this. These are hardened steel, so they're very strong. To remove the lock ring, this part tool also has one, but my daughter won this in a race when she was competing. This is a Pedro's, which is on the short side, but is also very well designed and fits the lock ring well. It also has some other size tools like a bottle opener, a hex wrench, and another for a nut. I don't know, I've never used this part, but I'm sure they're pretty good. Okay, so let me flip the bike over again. And because the fixed cup side is pretty dirty, and I want to remove the FOD, because when we remove the spindle on the bottom bracket, this whatever's on the outside has a chance of getting on the inside. And so I want to clean this up. The fixed cup generally is not going to be removed. They are not difficult to remove when you have the right tools to do that, but if you don't, it is. And the right tool is to remove a fixed cup. The recommendation is get the fixed cup removing tool, which is a very large thin wrench, and then bolt it in place with a large washer and a nut on through the shell so that the wrench doesn't flip out or slip. And then you can tap it out using a piece of wood and a hammer. Okay, let's continue on here and see if this adjustable ring can loosen up. And it loosens right up. And we'll clean off the threads on both the ring and the adjustable cup. Okay. Put this part in here. And then you can also use instead of, if you don't have a pin wrench, you can try using needle nose pliers. You might need to machine down or grind down the tip of it to get it to fit in there properly. Just push down on these, but you don't want to hammer it with a screwdriver and damage the cup. That's just not necessarily, it's unsightly, it's poor quality. All right, you want to strive to do high quality work. All right, so let's clean out the threads while we're here. This uses caged bearings. You can see the bearings are in a holder. The grease is pretty dry. There doesn't appear to be any pitting in the adjustable cup. Just remember the direction of the bearings when they're in a holder. So the holder is like this, okay? These bearings are in good shape. Let's pull out the bottom bracket. This is a spindle. Just keep in mind which side is left and which side is right. So in this case, this is pointing up. It has letters on this, and so when you're looking at it from this point of view, then the writing is correct. This is Shimano D-3NL. This is a fairly common bottom bracket. This is beginning to show some scoring on it. So if you had a spare, I would put it in. I don't have a spare, so we'll lube it, clean it up, and put it back in. There's an accordion in here, and I'm not sure if I can get it out easily. There's an accordion or a bellows in here to protect the bottom bracket from debris coming down the seat tubes or the down tube. And if you don't have one, you can fabricate one from a thin sheet of plastic, like from a soft drink container or a water bottle. That'll work. Stick your finger in there, pull this one out. This looks like it has some water damage to it because it's a little on the rusty side. But the bearings look like they're in okay shape, so we'll clean them up and we'll repack the bearings with grease. Okay, that was like this. Then I'll try to clean the fixed cup as best we can. That looks pretty good. The cups are usually in good shape because they're made out of heat treated steel. And the part that's meant to wear out would be the bottom bracket spindle, this, as well as the bearings. So let me try cleaning this a little better with some oil. looks good. So you want the ball bearings to be in contact with the cups and the spindle, so they would be facing outwards. And you'll know if you have it incorrectly placed because your spindle's not going to spin, right? Okay, these bearings on the drive side are pitted, so I'll need to replace those. I'll show you how I do that. The bearings on this side, the non-drive side, are fine. So what I'll do is I'm going to swap bearings, put the non-drive side bearings onto the drive side, and then I'll put new bearings on the non-drive side. Okay, this is how I do it. Here's some automotive grease, and the first step is put a layer of grease on the cones, put a layer of grease on the spindle. Okay. These are the good bearings. So I'll pack the bearings with grease here. You can only put so much into it. Okay. Get the accordion. You don't want to forget that. Okay. Get the bottom bracket, make sure it's oriented properly. Put that down. All right. And I'm going to go get some replacement ball bearings. Okay, what I have here are Wheels Manufacturing, a bottle of ball bearings, 1/4 inch. And you can buy individual ball bearings at the bike shop. They don't cost very much. I highly recommend you do that. Or just, buy a bottle like this. So I'm going to put in loose bearings here, loose balls. And we're going to fill up the... Okay, so it looks like my camera ran out of capacity and stopped. But I ended up screwing back in the adjustable cup, and then the lock ring, and then tightening that up. And I used the pin wrench and the lock ring tool. This happens to be from Pedro's. And then I oiled up, put some grease on the square tapers, and I used a chunk of wood and a mallet, bam, and hit it just once to get the crank seated onto the bottom bracket spindle, and then using the bolt screwed it back in, and then tightened it down using the 14mm thin wall socket. Okay, and now that I'm back, I unloaded the extra files on the SD card onto my computer. We'll continue on. It's getting pretty warm here, so I want to get this finished up. So on the crank side, I noticed that there were some burrs on the sprocket, and so I used a flat file to file these off. And the reason why is because when you have burrs on the outside of the sprocket, either on the chainring on one side or on the inside, then the chain will tend to stick. We call that chain suck. And so I've learned that by removing the deformation around the edges of the socket of the sprocket, then the chainring will release the chain under load. Alright, so I've greased the spindle on this, and so I want to realign the chain, and Now mount this, so that they're 180 degrees out of phase. And wrap it once. And that is to get the crank mated properly to the spindle. Okay, and I'll screw this in as far as I can by hand, and then using the crank as a handle, screw the fixing bolt into place. And you want this to be fairly tight. You don't want it to come loose later on. Okay. There's an access hole slot here for this plate. You want it to be away from the crank so that you can get a screwdriver blade in there. Okay, and this pretty much completes a bottom bracket lubrication. Okay, and ride this for a little bit and then come back and check for play by pulling in and out the cranks. And if it's loose, then on the adjustable side, loosen up the lock ring and tighten up the adjustable cup. I don't have a video to show you how I removed the headset cup, but what I used is a copper pipe and a hammer, and I drove it in from one side, caught the lip, and then tapped it out by tapping around this on both sides, and the cups come out. The stacks are hardened steel, and so they can take quite a punishment. Okay, now these have been soaking in some oil to loosen up the accumulated grease. There is a top and a bottom stack. The bottom stack of a headset is the first stack to wear out. When you need to replace these, you don't need to buy a pair. You can just buy the bottom stack. Okay. The condition of these look pretty good. So these are just press fit in. Okay. These are Ritchie. Tom Ritchie makes good components of good quality. So if Yost Brandt can race on them and beat them up and they survive, these are good enough for most everybody else. Okay, so there's printing on this, but this is the bottom. This is probably the top. Important to get these correct, otherwise you can do the job again. Try that. Here's the fork. This is the bottom stack. Got cobwebs on this now. And here's the top stack. This should fit together. Very good. Okay, so let's put this together. You can generally do this simply using a chunk of wood, a 2x4. I happen to have this, which is a piece of maple, and you can carefully tap this in. The headset, the head tube up here, these are machined surfaces, and so they're very square. So as long as you're careful, you should be able to carefully tap this in. Just try tapping it in this way. But you do need a square surface to get this started. Okay. So a series of small taps or better. Just be that's almost all the way in. And that's good. So let's flip this over. I need to finish this up because it's getting very warm out here. Yesterday it was 105 degrees. Okay. That's almost completely embedded. If you wonder about this hammer handle, I made this hammer handle myself, and I love it. Okay. So the next step will be to install the fork. While the fork is off the bike, I'm going to take the time to disassemble the cantilevers and lube the pivot. And what I want to point out is on the pivots on this one, there are 3 holes for the cantilevers, and on this side it's in the lowest of the 3 settings, and on this side it's on the middle of the 3 settings. So what I'll do is when I disassemble it, I'll replace it and move them back up to the top setting. And before I do this, what I want to do is polish this with some baking soda and water, just to clear off some of the oxidation. And everybody has baking soda, so it works pretty well as a polish. It's a little too much here, but since I painted parts of the bike, there was some overspray, and the light polishing will help to eliminate some of that, but it'll also get rid of the oxidation. Put that over here and I'll use that again later on. It also helps to get rid of some of the leftover grease. Okay, so we'll just move this off to the side, and I'll wipe this down. Okay, let's get on to the job. So when working on brakes and parts, it's best to just work on one at a time instead of taking everything apart. Now, here's a 6mm screw with a washer. Okay, this is the side that's in the most setting, and this pivot has some oil on it, so that's good. And I first put oil on everything, so the bearing surface looks good. It's free of rust, and this is a brass bushing, so I'll just get a small amount of grease, and we'll put this back in the uppermost setting that has the most spring tension, and I'll screw this in. Make sure this moves easily and that it doesn't bind. All right. Okay, and here's another M6 with a thrust washer. When you wash a bike, you know, the inner surfaces rarely get clean. So this is an opportunity to inspect and clean them up. Okay, there's no rust on this bearing surface. So put some grease on that. We'll move this spring back up to the uppermost setting. Oh yeah, this side is very tight. I think that's why it was moved down one. Now it's very loose. Okay, well let's put that back in where it should be, in the topmost setting, and we'll see what we can do to adjust that. Sometimes you have to rebend the spring if it's that far off. Okay, and we'll torque this down. All right. So that's it for lubing the pivots on a cantilever brake. We'll set this aside and proceed on to the next job. All right, there is some overspray on the frame, and so from the fluorescent, so I can see that clearly on when it's on the black. And so I'll polish this off. It comes off pretty quickly and easily, so it's not a problem. I did spray parts of these stays with black paint, and I didn't bother to mask it. I just freehanded it, so you can see a demarcation. So I want to kind of polish that off so it gets removed. Okay, and then over here on the top tube there's also some spray, so I think there's some tape residue up here. So this helps to clean it all up. Okay, and this is baking soda, so when I wash the bike, it'll rinse right off also. Okay. Yeah, so that takes the mild polishing from. All right, so let's service the rear pivot on these cantilever brakes. We'll work on just one at a time. This has a thrust washer on an M6 screw. Yeah, I can't stress enough how important it is to only work on one sub-assembly at a time, even though you can have the ability to do more. It's just that when a problem develops and you end up losing a part, which could happen at any time, it becomes much more difficult when you have more than one to look after. So we'll put this back on the top setting and work back from there. Okay, and here's the thrust washer. If you don't have a thrust washer that fits properly, that clears, is undersized, then your cantilever is going to bind when you apply torque to it. All right, that one's good. Let's go to the next one. So just work slowly and deliberately so that you don't make a mistake. Problem with working fast is that you end up making mistakes, and then whatever time you saved, you're going to use that up trying to recover from it, finding a loose part, breaking a part. So when we do fix our bike day, I have to remind the volunteers is don't work so fast that you can't do a high quality job, because if you break a tool, then we've got to replace it, and that's going to slow you down. Alright, so here we go. That's good. Let's put some tape over the chainstay, and so I've got some electrical tape. I have various colors. 3M sells a whole range from gray and black and white, but you know, if this bike were blue, like on the Trek, my first 950, then I would use blue tape, and if it was a green bike, then I would use green tape, and red as well. Okay, there we go. And if I wanted to, I can put tape over here too on the other side of the chainstay. Okay, I think we're ready to put on the headset and the fork. Okay, so on the fork we have the bottom stack and the top stack. And a headset, the bottom stack always wears out first, because that's where all the force is. And so you could possibly replace the bottom stack a number of times before having to replace the top stack here. Okay, so I've cleaned off the race. Here's some grease. I buy this from the auto parts store. It comes in a tube, like using a grease gun, and I just manually push it out and fill up this container here. Okay, here's the original bearings, which are in still fairly good shape, and I soaked them with some motor oil to loosen up the crud. You want to make sure you don't lose any of these bearings, and if any of the bearings are bad, then you should replace all of them. Okay, these bearing containers pop out, are not very tight, and so it's very easy for the bearings to fall out like they are now. Want them to you want to use as many bearings as possible. Alright, so let's try to get the grease in here, and then we'll pack the grease for the bearings that are proceeding to fall out. If I had a little screwdriver, I can bend the little retainers in. Okay. And so let's try not to lose any bearings here. It's always good to work with a towel underneath this so that any bearings that fall out will get caught in that. Okay, so these bearings are pretty well lubricated. Put this in without hitting the camera here. There we go. Oh, hold on. Back out. There is a little rubber seal here that goes on the bottom of this. Here it is. It's a moisture seal. There we go. That's good. Let me walk around. So on this side, we have the top stack. Okay. Alright, so we'll put a layer of grease here on this cone. Slather a whole bunch of grease on this. This is called packing the grease. Okay. Then push up. And try as you might not to strip the threads, cross thread this, screw this in as best you can. Okay, and then let's rotate this a little bit to make sure the bearings get embedded, because this doesn't happen in regular use, because the fork only rotates a little bit. Okay, and then let's remove the excess grease from the bottom. Okay, and I think we're ready to put on our keyed washer. It has a little keyway here, and so install that. If you don't have a keyway washer, you need to get one, because when you tighten this up, that washer is going to spin. This one happens to have two. You need to have enough threads so that you can lock down safely, but you want to make sure that the top of the fork stem doesn't hit the inner diameter of this lip here. Okay, this one looks like it has 2 or 3 threads to it. All right, let me get my headset wrench and we'll tighten this up. Okay, so having just two headset wrenches works out well. If you don't have 2 headset wrenches, 1 headset wrench and a crescent wrench will work. It's just that it needs to be larger than 12 inches. A 12-inch crescent wrench isn't going to cut it. It's just a little bit too small. So I think you need the next size up would be like a 16-inch. Let me loosen this a little bit. There we go. Okay, that feels pretty good. We can fine-tune that once we have the bike all together. So the next step now is we can put on the handlebar stem, the handlebar, and begin cabling up the shifter and the brakes. So here's this handlebar stem, and before I install it, I'll put a layer of grease on the dogs, otherwise known as the wedge bolt. This often gets stuck, and we'll put some grease inside the fork tube. Okay. We'll install this at its highest point, because that's usually the most comfortable for the user. All right, there we go. And we'll fine-tune that later on. Okay, so here's a handlebar after it's been repainted, and I think this is a 5mm wrench. So let me loosen this up a little bit. get a small amount of grease, and we'll grease the inside, the contact point where the handlebar goes, so that it doesn't squeak. Center up the bar. There we go. And as well as get the elevation correct and the angle. And we'll again fine-tune that later on. Okay, there is a left shifter here, so we'll install that. Okay, that's one. Let me get the other one. Now, not all of these cables are going to get replaced. On some of these vintage bikes, these motorcycle brake cables, and so we want to try to reuse those as possible because they last forever. They're stainless steel, they don't rust. Alright, so we've got the brake levers on, and on this setup, the barrel adjuster pulls out. Put down a layer of grease on the inside as well as over the ferrules as they go into the cable holder on both sides underneath the bar, because they tend to get rusted. As a point of detail, when you route these cables, your cables that go in the front, service the front brake and the front derailleur, go in front of the cables that go to the rear, such as the rear brake and the rear derailleur. And so just keep that in mind when these cables go in. If that's not the case, then remove the pod or the shifter or the handlebar and get them correct. The routing on this one, since this is the rear brake, is on the left side of the stem, then I've got the rear brake going to the left side of the stem as well. So because these vintage bikes sometimes use motorcycle brake cables, they're very strong, there's very little stretch, they're stainless steel. You might still be enticed into using the modern day brake cable, and I really don't advise doing that. One of them you're going to find is you get a lot more cable stretch, and so your braking feel and performance is not nearly as good, and you're going to wonder why. This is the reason why. On the 7-speed index shifter, to remove the cable, shift so that you're in your outermost gear, and try pushing the cable with your hand, and you can see the cable popping out. And so this will give you an idea. If you were to remove the cable, then you can, without removing the access cover, you can carefully slide a replacement back in and it'll come out the adjuster. Okay, this is a good time to either screw in the adjuster all the way or unscrew it and remove it. But just remember, if you remove this, it's spring loaded, a spring will be popping out with it. And if you're working on the lawn like me, then you're almost guaranteed if you don't catch that spring, it's going to get lost. So I feel lucky today. Let's try replacing the cable. Here's some beeswax, and we'll just run it through 2 passes. That's enough. So carefully I'll pull this one out and see if I can get the next one in. No guarantees I can do this, but we'll try. Oh, there it is. Comes out the other side. Now I had this shifter soaking with some oil, and so the ratcheting mechanism seems to work. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. All right. So I didn't even have to take it apart. So we'll coil this up for now. Incidentally, the straddle cable on this brake here, the front brake is rusted. I can replace this, but you rarely see these break. So I'm coating it with some grease, and we'll just leave it for now. meaning I'm not going to change it. Okay, so I'm going to try replacing the cable on the left side. So I'll run the new cable through the beeswax. There we go. Then pull the old cable out. These new cables, the tip of the cable is welded, so as long as you don't cut it, it'll be one solid piece, which makes it easier to feed through. Okay, so let's see if I can carefully find this. There it goes. What luck. Okay, and let's coil this up. At this point, it's probably worth our time to put on the handlebar grips, and I'll show you how to do that. So to install handlebar grips, you want a solvent. In this case, I have hand sanitizer that I also use as alcohol fuel for my camping stove, and it's methanol and ethanol. I don't recommend using isopropyl alcohol because it's highly poisonous. So what you do is we'll squirt a little bit on the inside of the handlebar grip and roll it around. And then carefully, all in one go, push it in. And then get it centered up. Make sure the lines are straight. And you're good. All right? I'll do it again. So I just rolled on the I can see the paint getting scraped off here. I'll adjust this gap here on the left and right, and then we'll tighten up the levers. So this is an 8mm wrench. Alright, so let's try bringing this down to 6mm, the thickness of this wrench here. We're really kind of going for aesthetics now. And we'll just eyeball the rotation of where your hand would go in on one side, and then eyeball it to match the next. And then we'll tighten up the pinch bolt a little bit. This is happens to be a 5mm. So this side is very loose, but build up the paint. Alright, so let's check that again. Okay, that looks pretty good. Alright, so I might need to tighten this up a little bit more. Not too tight, because we're going to need to adjust it again. Okay. So now let's cut the compressionless shift cable, and we'll route it from the shifter down to the appropriate locations down here on the frame. Okay. The amount of compressionless cable housing is dependent upon the maximum length, and so if the handlebar is rotated to the opposite side of the connection, it'll be here. All right. but you want it to be short enough so that you have a fairly straight exit and entrance. So this looks pretty good. Let me cut that. So I got a ferrule on one end. Here's another 4mm ferrule for compressionless, and you want to use compressionless on index shifting, because that's how index shifting works. You just make sure you don't get this mixed up and put it on your brake lever, because on your brake line, because this will create an untenable situation, because you're going to look at a failure. Okay, there we go. And then we'll run this underneath the bottom bracket. Run the cable down here underneath the bottom bracket line. Okay, and then let me move the cable over here, and then we'll have a stretch of cable from here to here. It's a fairly short distance. So you want the cable to enter straight and exit straight. Having it too long, then there's too much of a loop. So maybe around here. Alright, so let's insert a 4mm ferrule on one end. On the trailing end, and then sometimes you need to enlarge the hole. Small drill or needle will work. There's a slot underneath here in the guides. Make sure all of your barrel adjusters are screwed in to the maximum. That looks pretty good. The exit and the entrance are all seem to be in line. For now, I'll hand tighten that. So if I look at the cable run here, this looks reasonably good. There's a lot of excess. To me, this seems to be a little bit on the long side. Okay, but all right, let's try the other. All right, so let's try fitting the front cable on. Front cable housing, and we could pretty much just mimic the distance that we have on the rear. All right. Okay. Feed that one in. Use one of my valuable metal oxide coated steel ferrules. Feed that one in. Okay. Make sure that ferrule adjuster's fed in. There's a slot here. Feed in that cable. All right. Then we'll run this through the Derailleur cable guide up here. All right, and then through the pinch bolt. Okay, that looks pretty good. And we'll hand tighten that for now. Okay, that pretty much completes the initial cable run for front and rear derailleur. At this point, we can put the wheels on and start adjusting the brake cables and the derailleur cables. So I'll install the front wheel. The quick release lever is on the non-drive side, and so I'll open up the cam. The quick release is completely opened. I'll spin this down until it makes contact, right, and then I'll start adjusting, backing out or tightening the quick release until I'm able to close it. All right, then we'll rotate this so that we have a good position on it. All right, and that's good. All right, and then all right, we'll need to install the pinch bolt on that. The rear wheel, I have the quick release on this, and it's preferable that the derailleur be shifted to the highest gear. Now I'll screw in tighten up the adjustable bolt on the quick release, and then begin trying the quick release lever on the non-drive side. Well, all the while I'm pulling up on the rear wheel. Right. Okay, that's good. So let's attach the pinch bolts on the brakes. Now there's an acorn nut and a washer, and then we've got the cable that runs through the nut. Looks like this is a little bit on the long side. So I might need to either trim off, let me put this all back together and trim off the cable housing. Let's see, no, this is the original cable housing, so that hasn't changed. Oh, I see. The cable housing wasn't fully seated. Okay, so this should go back together again, just exactly the way it was taken apart at. Okay, so put in the washer. This is a special washer, so you don't want to lose that. And then put in the straddle cable. Alright, and then we'll tighten up this acorn nut. Try the brakes and see how they work. So gently pulling the levers, I can see both calipers move equally. They engage at the same time. The wheels are true because I trued up the wheels. So this is pretty good. Just remember, when I took this off to lube the pivots, these springs were in different holes, and now they're all in the same hole in the uppermost position. Okay, so let's try to assemble the front brake here. And the front brake has a pivot here, or it has a ferrule. Goes under the bar, there's a pulley. Okay. The pinch bolt is on the non-drive side. Pinch bolt is on the drive side, okay. And There's a acorn nut and a washer. So again, this is a special washer. Try to pull this up to where it was before. Tighten it by hand. Okay, and then let's attach the straddle cable. Ooh, that's not going to touch. That's not going to reach. Okay, so I just readjusted, loosened this, and recentered the straddle cable down a little bit, so it's more, the center is more towards me, and the brakes feel much better. All right. So I can actually let go, release some of the tension on the non-drive side. All right, that seems better. Okay, and so I suspect if I look at the others, the rear, that might be the same also. Okay, so let's adjust the rear derailleur, and first we'll check the range. Well, that was kind of bad. Let's see. All right, so looks like the B screw needs some adjustment. Though it looks like maybe the derailleur hanger is bent. So let me get the derailleur hanger alignment gauge and straighten this up. Alright, so let's align the derailleur. Just about every vintage bike needs this. So let's take the chain off of chain ring. Okay, and using a 5mm wrench. And this derailleur is kind of loose also. Support the derailleur so that when it comes off, it doesn't perhaps strip the threads. This is a Park Tool DAG 2. There are many manufacturers of this. They're all pretty good. You must have the best, buy an Abbey tool. Same guy that designed this, but it's the later version. It's a world of difference. Okay, so you want to screw this in all the way so that it's seated. So geometrically, 90 degrees, or 0 degrees, 90, 180, 270 degrees. Most people start at 270 degrees because that's where the tool falls. Realistically, the place to start is at 180 degrees and then 80. That gives us the first bend to be correct. Okay? So I can tell right off the bat this is off by about that amount. So the reference point is the valve stem. The wheel is true. Okay? So we'll pull this out, rotate the wheel, come out here, and you can see there's that much gap. So use this as a crowbar, bend it in halfway. All right. Well, that was more than halfway. All right. And then rotate the wheel back. Okay. And we'll bend this in a little bit. The reason why we use the valve stem as a reference is because if the wheel is warped or the axle is broken, you have a good chance of still getting a decent reading. Okay. So repeat this until you have something that looks pretty good. Okay. Tighten up this gauge again. All right. Okay, that looks pretty good. That's out by about 1 millimeter. Okay, there we go. Good enough. Okay, let's come up and go to 90 degrees. This is off by about the width of my index finger. So let's pull that out halfway. So now it's down to my pinky. All right. All right, so let's pull it out a little bit. Reset the feeler gauge. Come to the top. Oh, I think that was too much. Okay. Let's go back down to 270. Yeah, definitely too much here. Okay. Reset the depth. Okay, that's about within 1 millimeter there. So now let's check 180 degrees again. That's pretty good. And that's very acceptable. All right. So if you started at 270 and at 90 degrees, then you adjusted for 90 or for the 180 degrees and 0, you're going to have to redo 270 and 90 again. So to avoid that, start at 0 and 180 degrees first. Okay, let's put the chain back on. So you notice I use a wrench or a screwdriver to grab the chain. Then I wipe it down. That way I don't need to use my fingers. Okay, we're running out of time here. Battery power is almost empty. So we'll attach the rear derailleur and try not to cross thread this. Okay. The rear derailleur has been, the hanger has been aligned, and the barrel adjuster on the front and the rear have been screwed in all the way. And the shifter is all the way to the outside, right? So for your front gear, you're in this. The shifter is to the innermost gear, which is uses the least amount of cable. Okay, and on the rear, you've shifted so that you're in the outermost gear, which uses the least amount of cable. So there's a significant amount of slack here. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to check the the limit screws and make sure that you can, if you manually push the gear, the derailleur all the way inwards, that the derailleur doesn't overshoot, right? And that you have good sound, that the jockey wheel is in line with the innermost gear, and likewise that the jockey wheel is in line with the outermost gear. You can tell this by pedaling slowly. I adjusted this so that just to be sure, and I can hear some clicking going on, so let me okay, let's try this again. It seems to be fairly tight, but there's a lot of dropping going on here. Alright, so I'll pinch the cable and gently feed this through, and when it drops to the position that I want, now I can begin to tighten up the cable, the pinch bolt. Let's use an open-ended wrench because my thumb is in the way. Okay. Now I have some experience with this, so then when I let the cable drop, or the derailleur drop when I was pedaling, I didn't let the chain drop all the way to the outermost gear. I let it drop to the next to the last, because I know there's going to be some built-in slack, and sure enough, when I started pedaling, the chain did drop into the outermost gear. Alright, so there's 1, that's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Alright, so now we're in the 7th gear. And that's the rear derailleur setup, back to factory specs, because your barrel adjusters are all the way in. Okay, so let's give this another tighten, and there's entirely a chance that you're going to need to do this again once the cable starts to stretch and all the parts start to fit in. So the next step is we'll cut this, trim the cable, and the cable length is variable. Since this pinch bolt is so close to the edge of the derailleur, usually you like to clip it so there's not too much overhang, but if you don't have enough, you can't hold on to it, so we'll just use 3 fingers. To service the shifter, you remove the cable and carefully remove the barrel adjuster. There's a screw that secures the cover, so you remove the screw, and this is what you have on the inside. This ratcheting mechanism doesn't work completely, and so I suspect it's this pawl here that is not engaging well. And so what I'll do is I'll get some oil and oil it, and it's pretty dirty in there, so I'll try cleaning it up also. Alright, so what I'll do is get my acid brush, and we'll brush away some of this stuff here. And this is a mixture of automatic transmission fluid and motor oil, SAE 30 weight motor oil. And sounds like some guy is blowing away the leaves in our neighborhood. So we'll just brush this around. So the nice thing about lubricating with oil is that it takes away the grit, the debris, whereas with grease, the debris and contamination is kept in the grease. Okay, let's wipe off this brush. Here's a small screwdriver. Let's see. Yeah, see this, the action of this spring is very slow, all right? And it's this spring action that determines if you're going to shift. So I thought this was working well enough, but it's obviously not. So new, this is assembled with grease from Shimano, and over time then of course the grease solidifies, and you have this problem. This solution at a bike shop is to replace this, because the labor rate is so high that it's more cost effective just to replace it. However, if you're just getting in, if you want to rebuild a bike, or if you want to get into cycle camping, you want to keep prices low. That is, you want to keep your expenses low, but it doesn't mean you want to put on cheap parts, right? Because with cycle camping and touring, you want to have high reliability, and cheap parts and high reliability do not go together. And especially you don't want to be stuck in the middle of nowhere away from a bike shop when you have a failure. So what I'm getting at is, so people who say, well, you can go bicycle camping with any bike, well, that's not true. You shouldn't go cycle camping with a cheap bike, because that could leave you with a problem, and the fix will be much more expensive in the long run. Okay, so we'll let this sit for a little bit, but already I'm able to shift. All right, this one didn't quite go, but I'm in a higher gear now. So let me work on this some more, and I'll recharge the battery. Okay, by rotating this, there is another pawl on this side underneath that is slow, and so I'll need to loosen that up also. Okay, so let me work on that and come back. I want to correct a couple of errors. This can is 50% automatic transmission fluid and 50% kerosene, right? And that's what acts as a solvent for loosening the joints and pivots on parts, and it's really good. And then once it's completed, then I can lube it with some SAE weight 30 weight motor oil, or heavier. On the Shimano, there are 3 pivots, and all 3 pivots need to work properly for you to have good shifting. Here's one, here's a second one, and this is a third. And a very small screwdriver like this or smaller would work fine, or you can use a pick. A needle could also work. And so these are spring loaded, and you just need to apply the solvent and move these back and forth until they work. This one here is the slow one, and it doesn't appear to be spring loaded, but working it back and forth like this and applying the solvent loosens it up, and now it does work. Let me demonstrate. Okay, so here's 1 click, 2 clicks, and so there are a number of intermediate ratchet points. So this is the highest gear, this is the middle, and that's the third. So now that's the lowest. And so you can see the various middle pawl working, and then this one will start to release also and stops in their correct location. So this is ready to go. I can rotate this back into position. I tightened it up so it wouldn't move. So let me get this back into position and we'll install some cables, okay? And I might as well do that now while I have it open. Okay, so I fed the cable through, install the housing. Just make sure that you're careful with that. The barrel adjuster includes an internal spring, so you don't want to lose those. Just feed it through the barrel adjuster, and there. And then as you're pushing in on the internal adjuster, screw it in. Okay, and screw that in all the way. We'll get the turn this around. We get the set screw here. Screw that in. Get that centered up. Some of these are shoulder screws, so you want to be sure not to lose this, because if it is a shoulder screw, it's very difficult to find a replacement for that. Okay, let's tighten this up a little bit. Try to get this into the correct orientation for the left and the right side. Okay. Okay, so now we're back to where we were. Here's the cable housing with the ferrule. This is kind of interesting. I'm working behind the camera here. Alright, so we'll feed this cable through. So if you wonder how long this takes me, using a camera like this, it's about 3 times longer. Alright, so I fed this into this cable stop here, and what I'll do is I'll run it underneath the frame here, pull it up. Alright, so we've got the cable pulled up through the cable stop, and I'll run the cable behind the anchor bolt. You need to remember we're on which side of the cable, on what side of the nut or bolt the cable is routed, because it makes a difference. It makes a difference in that your index shifting will work properly or not properly. Okay. I had a 9mm wrench here someplace. Don't know where it went to. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to manually shift the front derailleur to the largest. Try to get it to the largest chain ring. There we go. And then I can take the slack out of the cable. Okay, so the chain is in the large chain ring, and I pulled the slack out of the derailleur cable, and I'm able to move this a little bit by manually tugging on the wire. Okay, I'm going to apply a little bit of more friction to this. I am in the lowest setting on the shifter. The barrel adjuster is screwed in all the way. Right, I'm going to pinch this and I'm going to start to pedal, and I can see immediately the derailleur shifts to the lowest gear. So I'm going to cinch this up a little bit. This nut is somewhat rounded. Okay, I'm going to pedal and shift to the lowest gear in the back. So, and I am going to look at the gap between the chain and the cage in the lowest setting, and I want to be able to pedal without having too much friction, without the chain hitting the guard, but I want to have the minimum gap also. So right now it's making noise, and an eighth of a turn, there, that noise is gone. All right, and so let's try shifting the front. So now it's in the middle chain ring. Let's try this again. All right, so this has a number of small ratchets for trim. Let's shift to the largest chain ring. All right. And let's see if I can adjust the cage out a little bit, if that helps. Oh, okay. Well, there's a little overshoot there. So incidentally, when you're pedaling, if your chain falls off on the outside, then shift towards the innermost, and the reverse is also true. If you shift to the granny gear and it falls off, shift to a higher speed gear, and the chain should self-feed. All right, so what I need is a little bit more range here. Okay, so I've adjusted this, and there was an extra click on the shifter that I wasn't hitting, and so that's why the chainring was hitting the cage. Actually, it was hitting the cage on the inside portion rather than the outside. So once I have that figured out, now the shifts are really good. Okay, so this is acceptable. It's set to factory specs. All right, and so the index shifting in the rear is fine, and shifting in the front is fine too. So I think it's good for me to tighten this up. We'll clip the cable, put a cap on it, and I can begin, I can check all the fittings, make sure they're tight. Let's take it up for a ride. I can also service the pedals by drilling a small hole off to the side of this cap, large enough so I can put the oil spout of my oiling bottle in there and then give it a shot. Lean the bike and let the oil dribble out the other side, and then wipe up the mess. Okay? Okay, so this Marin Palisades completed. I took it out for a ride and made some adjustments to the saddle slope and so that it fits me, and made several laps around our block and through our pedestrian multi-use trail. The saddle was not in good shape, and if you look now, you can kind of see that it's been covered up a little bit. What I took is some shoe goo, a chunk of charcoal that I ground up in my mortar and pestle, added a little bit of toluene industrial solvent to it, mixed it up, and used a small artist paintbrush to paint it over. And I used about 2 or 3 coats to this, and then took some spray paint, black spray paint, and spray painted it so that it's nice and uniform. Okay, and once it's dried, it feels okay, and the roughness should disappear after you ride it for a few weeks. The friction from your butt on the saddle should smooth it out. My overall impression is, this is a nice riding bike, just like most of the others, like the Stump Jumper, my Rock Hopper, the Trek 920, and it also has the fittings. So I think this would make a good starter bike for a cycle camper, and as a matter of fact, you probably would like it so much you'd keep it for the rest of your life. No, I don't see any problems with this, and it's certainly robust. It has oversized tubes, all around. It's straight gauge chromoly, so it's going to last for quite a long time, and it has strong wheels too. These are 36 spoke wheels, so this is the preferred setup, and it's 21 speed. I put inner tube sleeves over the brand new handlebar grips, and so they're a little larger diameter, and that small diameter makes a big difference. It feels really good. The brake levers have good feel. So yeah, I think for practical cycle camping, this is a good way to start. I don't think there are very many Marin Palisades out there, but anything from Marin above this model, I think it would be worth your while to look at and to buy if you want to get into cycle camping. So between now and then, happy cycle camping. Tomorrow, Sunday, this will be going to one of my volunteer mechanics who's going to sell it to a coworker of hers. Okay, well, take care. Goodbye.